After the elimination of the Iranian leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, for some reason everyone decided that the main goal of the United States war against Iran was regime change. But that's not the case at all. Many people are now wondering whether Donald Trump intends to carry out regime change in Iran, and if so, how he plans to do it without a ground military operation. In addition, experts and historians insist that war has rarely led to real changes of power in authoritarian or dictatorial regimes. For example, the scholar Jenna Jordan conducted an in-depth study several years ago analyzing nearly 300 cases of the elimination of leaders of radical organizations and proved that removing the top leader very rarely leads to the collapse of stable authoritarian structures. And, I often return to such studies because they make me wonder what real goals Donald Trump is pursuing now in this war against Iran. If you listen carefully to his statements, he has already given an answer to this question a long time ago. And it lies in the fact that Trump is ready to keep those very clerics in power in Iran, and democracy may never come to Iran. And Trump will be satisfied with such an outcome. In this episode, we will discuss what are Donald Trump's real goals in the war against Iran, and what historical lessons should we consider when analyzing what is happening in the Middle East. My name is Alexei Pechi, and this is an attempt to revive my old project called Conspiracy Theories, where we debunk conspiracy theories and, through deep analysis, try to find the truth and call everything by its real name. A large-scale American-Israeli bombing of Iran might lead to a simple conclusion. Donald Trump wants to completely eliminate the Iranian regime, and that's exactly what many Iranians want to hear after decades of tyranny under the clerical regime in Tehran. And as we know, we often hear not what is actually said, but what we would like to hear. Well, for example, today Donald Trump categorically states, "The possibility of negotiations with Iran has been lost," unquote. Their air defense, Air Force, Navy and руководство страны уничтожены. Они хотят переговоров, а я сказал слишком поздно. After heavy strikes on Iran, it sounds like it's too late, we will destroy the Iranian regime. But watching Donald Trump's actions and statements regarding Iran, I realized that he might actually be ready to eliminate the top echelons of this regime, but at the same time not overthrow it completely. If you look more broadly at Venezuela, Cuba, and even at Donald Trump's pressure on Iran during his first term, you can see plenty of evidence that Trump is seeking to use new ways to reshape governments he doesn't like. But he doesn't seek to eliminate it. That's the key difference. Well, let's try to answer the question of whether it's even possible to eliminate an authoritarian or dictatorial regime through external pressure or a military air campaign, or, if you like, by eliminating the head, the leader of that regime. And in this regard, I really like the in-depth research by Jenna Jordan from the University of Chicago, which I often return to whenever the topic of any war comes up. So, back in 2009, she analyzed almost 300 cases of the elimination of leaders of radical organizations. And she proved that removing the top leader, in our case Ali Khamenei, very rarely leads to the collapse of stable authoritarian or dictatorial structures. Especially if the organization is old, large, and particularly religious, as is the case now in Iran. Jenna Jordan. Jenna writes that the attempt to decapitate an authoritarian regime has become a key feature of modern counterterrorism policy. Well, as you already know, Trump declared the regime in Iran a sponsor of terrorism. Many politicians claim that eliminating leaders like Ali Khamenei is an effective strategy in the fight against terrorism. They say that if you remove the leadership, the structure collapses. Jenna Jordan studied a dataset from 2 articles. 298 incidents involving the removal of dictatorial or authoritarian leaders from 1945 to 2004 to determine whether decapitating a regime or group is effective. And here I'll quote Jenna Jordan. The data show that the age, size, and type of a group or regime are crucial in determining when to decapitate. Decapitation will lead to the cessation of terrorist activity. As an organization grows in size and age, it is much more likely to withstand the removal of its leadership. The organizational type is also important for understanding the organization's susceptibility to decapitation. Ideological organizations are most likely to experience cessation of activity after the removal of their leader, whereas religious organizations are very resilient to decapitation. Обезглавливанию руководства. The data show that regime decapitation does not increase the likelihood of organizational collapse beyond the baseline level of collapse. And next comes probably the most interesting quote from Jenna Jordan. Organizations whose leaders were not eliminated are more likely to collapse than those that survived the loss of their leader. The marginal utility of decapitating regimes is negative for many groups, especially for larger, older, religious, and separatist organizations. If we sum up Jenna Jordan's research, the conclusion sounds something like this. The higher the level of institutionalization, the less effect the removal of a leader has. A leader can be a symbol, but if there is an apparatus, a network, a succession mechanism behind him, then over time the system simply adapts to the fact that the leader can change. In 2013, researcher and international relations expert Michael Boyle reinforced this conclusion by Jenna Jordan, sort of from another angle through the analysis of drone warfare, the use of unmanned aerial vehicles in the war on terrorism. So he claims that yes, of course, targeted strikes by drones and missiles provide a short-term tactical effect, for example, strikes on a target, where Ali Khamenei and his high-ranking officials were located. But, as Michael Boyle claims, in the long run, they often lead to mobilization, radicalization, and a martyrdom effect among those very terrorists. The organization restructures, becomes more decentralized, and the very practice of targeted elimination, as in our case with Khamenei, reduces the political costs of using force and normalizes them. The conclusion from Michael Boyle's research sounds roughly like this. The precision of an assassination does not equal a strategic victory. You can cut off as many heads as you want, but this hydra will still remain alive. But even if we go further and imagine that we're not just talking about eliminating a leader, but about regime change, research still doesn't give us much reason for optimism. Alexander Downs and Jonathan Monton studied more than 100 cases of externally imposed regime change in the 19th century. There's even a specific term for this, externally imposed regime change. So their conclusion is this: regime change imposed from the outside very rarely leads to a stable democracy. Again, in the short term, there is sometimes an increase in formal, and I emphasize formal, democratic indicators, but after a few years, there is often a rollback to authoritarianism, a forceful consolidation, or some kind of civil conflict. A vivid example, by the way, is Afghanistan. The United States of America imposed their own leader there after invading that country. There was a president who proclaimed democracy and so on. As a result, after a few years, this president dismantled the army and fled Afghanistan even before the last American soldier left the country. Later, it turned out that the democracy and strong army in Afghanistan, funded by American taxpayers' money, existed only on paper. In reality, none of it was actually there. So the question is, what exactly did Donald Trump have in mind for Iran? And Trump has actually already answered this question. It's just that, for some reason, none of us wanted to hear it. Well, because we wanted to hear that he came to eliminate the entire Ayatollah regime. Trump recently made an offer to the remnants of power in Tehran to keep their positions in the government if they agreed to cooperate with Washington. And he immediately cited Venezuela as an example after the takeover by Nicolas Maduro. And here, remember the main thing. Donald Trump is not some fierce supporter of democracy. If authoritarian regimes do what he wants, he gladly cooperates with them, from Saudi Arabia to El Salvador. Trump's approach can be interpreted roughly like this. He is willing to settle for changing a regime's behavior if he can't overthrow the entire regime. And what interests him most is changing how that regime interacts with the United States. The point isn't to overthrow the regime, but to change its behavior. And here, ask yourself the key question: how many people need to be overthrown for the regime to disappear? Or can a sufficient number of changes in the regime's behavior lead to its replacement? Regime change requires a certain degree of state building from scratch. Is Donald Trump's team ready to deal with all of this? Honestly, Venezuela has shown they aren't ready or prepared to build a state from scratch. That's why I would call Trump's actions in Iran a regime transformation. This approach means that the structure of the regime as a whole remains unchanged, but its behavior changes in such a way that it aligns with the interests of the United States of America. Not necessarily values, I emphasize, but interests. Values may not coincide, but interest must coincide. And Trump essentially says that regime transformation is acceptable, even without overthrowing that regime. And notice that Trump applies different approaches to different countries and regimes. In Venezuela, it's a quick special forces operation and capturing the leader. In Cuba, it's an economic blockade. In Mexico, it's pressure on the authorities to make them actively fight the drug cartels. In Iran, it's open war. And in none of these cases does it lead to a complete dismantling of the existing power structure. Nowhere. And just on Monday, U.S. Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth stated that the U.S.-Israeli operation in Iran, quote, is not a so-called war for regime change, but the regime will certainly change. That's a quote from Pete Hegseth. That's what we've been talking about this whole episode. But isn't that a hint at a change in the regime's behavior rather than its elimination? And again, even now, when Trump is bombing Iran, he declares his readiness to negotiate with the remnants of the Iranian Islamist leadership, which indicates his desire to preserve the main structure of the existing regime. Because if you are determined to eliminate the regime, you can't be open to any negotiations. At the same time, Trump has already openly called on the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps to side with the people, not to disband themselves, not to be eliminated, but to join with the patriots of the country. That is, Trump is not against the preservation of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps as such, but he is in favor of this corps changing its behavior. Trump stated that the U.S. is determined to eliminate nuclear and ballistic capabilities and to stop its support for terrorist groups, since all of this poses a threat to America's national security. If the remnants of the Iranian regime agree to his demands on these issues, that may be enough for Trump to end the military phase. And if Trump goes for the complete destruction of the regime, then who will actually take power in this Iran? That's the question. And won't this country, turn into a hotbed of terrorism when there is no centralized authority? Venezuela is now a vivid example of Donald Trump's approach. The US rather quickly captured the Venezuelan autocrat Nicolas Maduro, and the entire power apparatus of that same Nicolas Maduro eventually changed its behavior and began to cooperate with Trump. That was more than enough for Trump. And notice, the Maduro regime as a whole remained in place. All his people stayed in power, but they changed their behavior. And so, in conclusion, I want to add once again that I believe Trump's main doctrine, his main strategy, is not regime change, but the transformation of that regime. I'll leave it there. Friends, share your opinions and conclusions in the comments below. And also let me know in the comments if it's worth reviving. Maybe some of the longtime viewers remember the very same Conspiracy Theories project where we analyze various topics together like this. So it's not exactly a news feed, but more of an analysis of what's happening, with my own, sometimes subjective, conclusions. Share your opinion in the comments below this episode. And friends, I ask you to support this channel with your donation, your subscription, through the links and details in the description of this video, or by using the QR code on your screens. I will be grateful for any support from you. That's all for now. Take care. Goodbye, everyone.
Igor Negoda.
Igor Negoda.